It's great to connect with you after so many connections through LinkedIn and email.
Yes, it is.
It's great. It's really great. So,
Can you hear me now?
yes, now I can hear you properly.
Okay, good. Well, it's so nice to see you. And we've been discussing this for a few months, and I appreciate your patience with me as October is one of the busiest months that I have.
Yes, definitely.
You freaked out to me. I said, okay, I'd love to do it, but let's wait until a little later. So thank you so much, and it's so good to see you.
It's my pleasure. It's a really great pleasure to have you in our podcast today. Already there are about, I can say, 130 plus members have joined throughout the world.
That is terrific.
Yes.
You're doing a great thing here, being able to bring people together and letting us,
Yes, also.
Sure.
Yeah. Most of them through LinkedIn, the people who are abroad, most of them, and it's by God's grace, everyone is supporting, everyone is coming to join also. Because, like for today, everyone likes the online platform. Who can sit like you're from your own comfort zone, I'm from my own house, room. So it's great. And now can we start?
Yeah, but I will say too this, it's great for us academics need to connect. We need to use these platforms to connect with each other and learn from one another. And, the fact that you're putting the effort in to do this and to get that dialogue started is commendable. Thank you. But yeah, I'm ready to get started whenever you are and kind of shed some light on my little corner of the United States here.
Yeah, it's great, really. I have been to United States twice, once in Philadelphia, even in New Jersey and New York, and another time I went in 2023 in Atlanta. I spoke in the MLA University. Yeah. So twice I've gone there and other places also. So without further delay, let us now start. And first of all, I warmly welcome you to our research academia and to speak your valuable lines, to speak your valuable things. And so we welcome today in our research academia Professor Gillian Hartley, Professor of History at Arkansas Northeastern College, USA.
Yes, thank you for having me, Dr. Ghosh.
Yeah.
Are you going to share my PowerPoint, or do you want me to share the PowerPoint?
Yes, you can share. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me try to. Go ahead and share, because I know that there's, I think I sent you over.
I have to allow you, right?
You have to allow me, yes.
Yes.
And then let me see here. I'm going to try to bring it up.
Okay.
And I know most people are kind of patient because technology is great, but sometimes it takes a minute.
I can see.
Okay. Yeah, so you can see that. All right, let me get back to you where I am. Okay. So you're able to see the Delta Heritage part on your end, correct?
Yes.
I'm trying to get back to you now. I can see it, but yeah, so in my little neck of the woods, one of the things that I have a background in both history and heritage. I am a graduate of the PhD program of Heritage Studies from Arkansas State University, and that's been probably close to a decade ago that I finished that program, and it's been amazing to see the progression of things since that time. And I welcome any questions and dialogue, because to me, any good podcast is just a good discussion. And so one of the things I start off with is, and if at any point I'm on a slide you can't see, let me know, because we can figure out live. But a lot of people, when they think of the Delta, have a tendency to think of, in our country, what's called Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, and they don't realize that the Delta actually goes much, much further north, and this is an area that actually was not settled on a large scale until after the American Civil War, so after the 1860s. It was predominantly a swamp land, and it had large, hardwood cypress trees and things like that, but it was deforested within a few decades, well, probably more like about 40 years after the American Civil War. And as everyone listening probably knows, when you deforest land, usually there's extremely fertile farmland underneath it. And of course, this is a pattern you can see all throughout the world. And so what people started doing here is they started growing a lot of cotton by the early 1900s. And so I have an image here to show the cotton connection because I have people who sometimes have never seen cotton. I actually have a little bit of it with me. And, being from India, I'm sure you all have plenty of cotton that's grown. But we have people who all the time come here and they'll want to grab it. They'll look at the bowls and things and touch it. And I think that probably goes to say that we have a lot of people who are somewhat removed from rural areas and what's produced in them. But this is actually an image from a famous postcard. They used to have a cotton picking contest here, and it was like a world-renowned thing. I think one year it made Time magazine's cover. But people would show up, as you can see in this particular photo, in suits to actually go pick cotton for this contest. I do want to, let me see. Can you see the map now that I have
Yes.
up?
Yes.
Okay, great. Since we have so many people, I'm hoping from throughout the world, listening to us, I want to kind of give a sense of where we are.
Yes.
I'm like you, I enjoy traveling, and I've been to Europe multiple times. And when people say, "Oh, you sound like an American," I'll say yes, and they'll go, "Well, where are you from?" A lot of people gravitate toward this area over here, New York, Philadelphia, D.C., people have a sense of place, or sometimes they jump to the California coastline. And as a native of Southern California,
Mm-hmm.
I'm somebody who have been here for, over 30 years, but a lot of people will say, well, where are you close to? And I say, well, Memphis, because I find that a lot of people throughout the world have heard of Elvis Presley.
Right.
And so, I'll go about an hour away from Elvis, and then it's like, oh, okay. But it's interesting because if you look at the Delta, technically, by definition, and coming from a country that has extremely large river systems, deltas are typically the areas where rivers flow out of. It's a strange thing because we have the Mississippi River that comes down. Actually, it comes down here. It meets the Missouri River here. And so around this little area here, you start to have more and more water flow down, and it expands out. And technically, this is an area that is classified as the alluvial floodplain of the Mississippi. So prior to drainage and actually the building of levees and things, and again, this is something that people all around the world have seen, that effort to try to control. This area over here, Mississippi, was actually developed prior to the American Civil War. By the 1820s, 1830s, people are developing it. This area over here, though, wasn't. And it's, of course, in Arkansas. Arkansas is an upper southern state. Since you've been to Atlanta,
Mm-hmm.
you've been to a place that was extremely urban, and like a lot of urban areas in the United States, they have a lot of commonalities, whether they're in the American South or in the North or the West. In the rural areas in the South, though, you're looking at places that did not have, for example, public school systems until the end of the 1800s. And it's also areas that have been defined in large part by agriculture, and the economy has been tied very much to the commodification of natural resources. But it's interesting too because, we have people who will visit this area and they will be looking for the type of, antebellum or pre-Civil War homes that you would find in places sort of lower like Mississippi or Louisiana. And one thing we would tell them is that, well, we don't have those. There's many large homes in places that have been built, but they've been built typically in the 1890s or 1910s and so forth. But I like to establish a sense of place for people, since this is not one of those areas many people are acquainted with throughout the world. And this is actually, I think, one of the reasons why I was so interested in this area, because when I started doing my doctoral studies, one of the reasons why that program was really started was in the hope that using kind of a model of the way that Mississippi has actually developed its delta for tourism and has marketed its heritage, this is an area that has a lot of similarities but had not been developed for that reason to that extent. And of course, I think I have on here some things that a lot of people, no matter where they are in the world, we see this divide oftentimes between our more rural and urban areas, the need to develop. And is this something that is pretty common in your area?
Right.
I mean, it is. It's not something limited to, I think, any one country. If people have flocked to more urban areas, they're looking for opportunity, following the jobs a lot of times. And at the same time, too, we have a lot of really open rural areas that have a heritage there that so many people are still tied to, even if, sometimes it's a few generations removed from it, if that. But because we've seen that migration to urban areas, there's been a lot of these places have either lacked for investment in infrastructure, or they're losing infrastructure due to not having the money or attention to maintain it. I know that people watching this can probably think of historical buildings that are in areas that have had to be torn down because when they are empty and they go for years without having any sort of caretaker watching for leaks and things, it doesn't take long before they are then condemned. And so at the same time, too, there's so much cultural identity. There's so much value that, and one of the things that we've really seen in Arkansas is a drive to try to commit some resources to developing these areas, to letting people know why they were important. And to that, I've actually got a picture at the back of this slide. People watching, maybe they've heard of the author John Grisham. John Grisham has published a number of novels like The Firm, and he's very well known in the United States. He actually was born in this area and spent the first few years of his childhood here. And a number of years ago, he wrote a novel called A Painted House, kind of depicting his upbringing in rural Arkansas those early years. This is an actual movie set that is about probably 30 miles from where I am that they used to make a movie out of that book. And, this is a town that has a very small population called Lepanto. But if you go to this area, there's all these signs saying you can visit this movie set. And this is a very typical home that you would have found built probably from anywhere from 1900 to about 1925. It's actually quite a nice home for that era around this time period. But, some of the examples that I have to talk about today, buildings, landscapes, monuments, we also have seen a real drive to look at those intangible elements, especially tradition.
Once I will just interrupt you.
Please do.
Yeah, that is for the students who actually we have to have a paper on archive and museums and also on heritage. So the students try to learn about the tangible and intangible aspects. So could you please elaborate on those? That what are tangible and intangible elements?
I would be happy to, and I'll even use some examples from this area. This is an area that one time had a very sizable indigenous population. And many of the people who lived here, like many people did in early river valleys, created a civilization where we have a lot of aspects of material culture in the form of artifacts from those people. And so when you're looking at artifacts, we're looking at tangible heritage. We're looking at material culture. It's something that you can typically hold, you can look at, we can oftentimes date it. Where when we're looking at the intangible elements, a lot of times you can look at traditions that people had that perhaps maybe are along the lines of things that perhaps maybe created elements like material culture for, but the traditions and the rituals and things are not necessarily things that we can really hold on to. I think probably the best example of intangible heritage is oral histories. And those things that, granted, we can use parts of those in a museum. We can take parts of an oral narrative and put it in an exhibit or have people hear it, but it's not necessarily that same thing. Is that, that's sort of our approach here to do that. And it can be somewhat difficult because I think when you look at the humanities, we try to pull everything in. You have to recognize those things that are extremely important that we can analyze artifacts and physical information or physical specimens for, but then also recognize that cultural traditions and those things that are passed along don't always have that form. And to that note, one of the things I've started here at our institution is an oral history project because as we're doing right now, these things are so much easier to share. We're at a time where because we can produce things electronically and save them, we can now hear things, because, if you went back 30 years ago to do oral histories, you would probably be using a cassette of some sort, right? And you would be putting it in a storage place, and people would travel and have to come in. And now we can actually just put these things on a digital format of some sort that anybody anywhere can hear, hopefully. It's pretty profound. I know that's a really long answer, Dr. Ghosh.
Yes.
I hope it was, because, the thing about humanities is so great. And, and I would be remiss not to say, we are at a time, at least here in the United States, where the humanities we're struggling to try to justify why we're needed, at a time where people really, when they make connections and they have a better understanding of the human condition, it can actually allow us to have a shared history and heritage, or at least shared humanity, that will bring us together through our struggles, even though we have cultural differences. And so that's part of the reason why, I've got here things like, history, literature, anthropology, music, sociology, all of this, we can understand that sort of cultural fabric. And understanding it, particularly with rural areas, is so important because even though obviously what I've just described I think is important, this can also create a way to build the economic structures better, because tourism is a phenomenal thing. And, it is one way that rural areas can continue, sustaining small businesses.
Right.
And to that note, if it's okay, I'm going to move on to my next slide.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So for some people who may not know this, there may be people who've heard of the musician Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash, of course, is more of he's sometimes sort of put into a country music category, but he was more of an outlaw type country person in the sense that he did not do anything that just fit into anybody's mold. But I'm using this as an example and something that can be a real catalyst for rural development, because there's a site in this area in Arkansas that's dedicated to him. And rural areas have had such issues with poverty. And this is an area where during the Great Depression, a lot of farmers were letting go of sharecroppers. This is prior to, there was some mechanization. We did have tractors and things, but it's sort of a precursor to the impact of industrialization during World War II, which will eventually lead to farmers needing so few workers like they are today. But I want to highlight Johnny, if I may, because Johnny Cash actually was in a family that was displaced during the Depression, and there was a person who donated a large plot of land for the creation of a colony for sharecroppers who were displaced to come to. And this is, the name of the place is, the locals pronounce it Dice, although, it's hard for me not to say Dice, but they say Dice. But it's a good example, it's only been, trying to think, really operational for about a decade. You've had this push to try to do something with his family home there. And this is a photograph of it. So this is a home that he lived in the 1930s and into the 1940s. And, it's funny because I've spoken to people. This is a heritage site that is attached to the University of Arkansas State University. And I've spoken to friends there who said, we kind of pull people in with Johnny Cash, but then when they're there, we teach them about sharecropping. Because, if you had a site that's, sometimes just, let us teach you about, sharecropping, it doesn't quite have the pull and the tug of, here's this very famous person, come here, we'll show you his house, and in the process, we'll tell you about the displacement of farmers. But they have tens of thousands of visitors a year. And this is a very, very small area. I also wanted to give a shout out to Johnny because the statue in this slide I think it was just last month. This is in Washington, D.C. Johnny Cash is now in the Capitol.
Okay.
But again, people who go, do what? I'm sorry.
From rural to urban migration.
Yes. The hope is, they kind of go hand in hand, so hopefully when people maybe go and they see the Johnny Cash statue in D.C., they may go, where is this guy from? And then suddenly you may have people who have a real interest in understanding the types of things that shaped him, because, this is an area that has a lot of musical traditions and backgrounds that come from people who were very much shaped by this rural lifestyle, that they're making music because they don't really have a lot else to do. There's not a lot of entertainment. The traditions like the blues and things that come from the United States come from these rural areas because people would, the best thing you could do for entertainment is buy a few instruments, and the families would literally sit out on the porch and just for entertainment play. Many of these areas don't have electricity until the 1940s. So there is no, unless you have somebody who's really creative trying to get a radio even going. But it's through those traditions that you see these cultural things coming together. Because, even Johnny Cash very famously, he had percussion instruments at a time that it wasn't common in country music. Because the percussion elements are oftentimes coming from our African-American influences, which date back to the African traditions that eventually will make their way here. And a couple of other examples, and we'll kind of get to one of the big ones, but, when you're looking at heritage, and we're looking at what's tangible and what's intangible, there's this interesting thing that happens when you have the intangible that you also then need to find a way to bring it to light and make it seen, because that's how people become more aware of it.
Mm.
And there's a place that is in this area, and it's called Twist. It's an actual town called Twist, Arkansas.
Okay.
But when we're looking at how do you kind of combine those things, how do you document stories, how do you provide a way to make people connect to those things that happened that we have no physical evidence for?
Right.
So one of the things I've got up here is that there's a musical artist named B.B. King who apparently played at a bar in this little area that now has a population of 6 people. And the bar burned down, and he ran in to get his famous guitar, Lucille. Well, of course, there's no bar there anymore. There's nothing there. But because he becomes so famous, there's a need to mark that place to be able to tell that story to people. And so, as we talked about earlier, too, one of the best ways to look at that heritage that we don't necessarily have that physical evidence for is oral history projects. You know, there's a lot of push to try to do more and more oral histories with rural areas. And, of course, this is just an example of a marker. And then we have a lot of other things in the area. It's actually the worst maritime disaster in U.S. history happened just down the river from me when this massive ship carrying United States prisoners of war who were held captive by the Confederacy. They were actually being sent upriver to go home, and it actually sank. And it killed more people than, like, the Titanic. However, I know, and it's on this riverboat. But they've attempted, they're creating, well, they have a museum, but they're attempting to make it even larger and have a larger thing there to kind of look at this horrific disaster that happened. Talking about the preservation of buildings. This is a building that sits in Blytheville, Arkansas, that was converted into a museum about 2014. But it's a good example of sometimes creating a way to using history and heritage to also preserve a building. You know, it's a rather large department store that would have not been unheard of in a lot of rural areas back in the 1930s and 40s. But as the population of the county went more and more down, it closed. Basically, the city decided to buy it and put a museum in it. And so this is a way to try to use history and heritage to, one, promote knowledge of the region, but also to recognize that buildings can be preserved this way. Because again, as we mentioned earlier, if you don't have something in a building that needs to be restored or needs to have constant upkeep, those buildings, you know, will eventually fall down. I have a wonderful quote here too. This was just a few weeks ago that somebody actually talked about, because, you know, Blytheville is a city that one time had a population that was, well over 30,000, that has about 11,000 people now. But this shows like a sense of, you know, if you go here, you get to actually go to their historic downtown, look at the museum. They try to bring in new things and rotate them. And so this is a good example of where you can also promote the heritage of a region, but also preserve buildings in the process.
So what are the challenges, Jillian, and opportunities in your study, can you tell me, while you were doing your research in these areas?
Well, and I've got a slide to get to a little more details about that in a minute, but I do think one of the big challenges is trying to get community involvement and buy-in, because, you know, with a lot of my research and studies, and somebody who loves to travel, there are things sometimes that people from the outside will see and see the value in it, that sometimes local people have a hard time seeing that. And so convincing people that the things that they see as being normal, or things that they see as being kind of just ho-hum. I think about people who live, for example, in India, who pass the Taj Mahal probably on a daily basis walking back and forth to work. Of course, this building that people will travel thousands of miles to see. But in a lot of ways, in rural areas, we have those things that stand out that become almost normalized. That the people there, and not to say that obviously I'm sure there's appreciation for it there, but that sometimes people don't realize how important something is when it's something that they just have. It's common to them. My grandma shopped there. What's the big deal? And I think one of the things that highlights that, and I know that we're interested in it, is Cold War stuff. And this is one of the best examples of this because, of course, everybody is aware that there was a Cold War after World War II between two big superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union, but it involved many, many countries, including India, countries in Africa. The Cold War, there's very few countries other than probably some Latin American countries that did not have some real direct involvement somehow in the Cold War. And the United States invested in a lot of Air Force bases during the Cold War with the intent of making sure there was a secure apparatus to prevent any sort of attacks on the United States. And they created the Strategic Air Commands in the early 1950s. Okay. And when they did that, they had alert facilities where it's my understanding that the pilots and the navigators would essentially go for sometimes up to like a week and just stay. And of course, they were on alert the whole time. Over here, this is actually the alert facility that is here. It is currently, it's actually Edgar Air Force Base. It was only renamed that the last few years. Most people know it as the Blytheville Air Force Base because that's the name it was for about 30 years. But now, and of course, I'm not speaking as a representative in any way. I do serve on the advisory board for this. But just looking at it from a heritage standpoint, my understanding is that our National Park Service, some time ago, actually contacted the city leaders because this is a base that closed after the Cold War. By the time the Russians were withdrawing from the Soviet Union, there was a clear discussion about how much money the United States was going to spend on infrastructure and maintaining things like alert facilities with that threat dwindling. And so the Strategic Air Command, the decision is made to close this particular base. Well, of course, years later, somebody contacts people and says, you realize that this is something really important and special. And again, a lot of people who are connected with it knew it, but you're looking at, several decades have passed, many people passed by, don't even know what it is. Yeah. And so the National Park Service basically said, this is really important, and it's a place that if you kind of started doing something with it, people would be interested in seeing these facilities. And so, but again, convincing people that the thing that they see is the norm and that they know that has been there sometimes is one of the biggest challenges because people who are, I dare say, outside the United States, familiar with the Cold War, the idea that the United States put this much effort into trying to protect itself in a time there are also nuclear weapons are being made, all this stuff, to me it is a very fascinating thing. So over here, I actually have an image of what is slated to become the National Cold War Center. Right now in Blytheville, there is a Blytheville Air Force Base exhibition. And it has a vision room for what this will become. But you can see here on this drawing, this right here is the facility. But they've decided to create, basically build a museum next to it that will be the National Cold War Center. And this alert facility right here, this is actually called a Christmas tree over here. Okay. Planes would literally line it from side to side. Formation going down, hence Christmas tree. And so this is something that's very exciting because it highlights how important areas like Arkansas, even though inside the country, very much in the interior, played a huge role when the United States was in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so this is a really exciting development. It's one of many things here, but I definitely think it's probably at the very, very top. And I've got a little more challenges and opportunities if we have time. I know we're kind of getting down to the wire, but and of course, if you've got any questions, like I said, I'm not really here as a spokesperson for the National Cold War Center, but I do have information that, if you have any questions about it, a lot of information's been published now about its mission and what it's trying to accomplish. So I'd love to answer any that's out there.
Oh no, what happened to it? Let's see. Sorry.
Right.
There we go.
Yes.
Are you all right? Yay!
Yes. Great.
One of the things, this is probably, I think, the best part of the conversation, because one of the things about this area is that, we do have a lot of smaller things that kind of draw people in. And in addition to that, we have a museum with indigenous artifacts from what we call the Mississippian era in a place called Wilson.
Okay.
So we have all of these smaller elements, but one of the things that there's great hope of is that the National Cold War Center is going to bring in more and more. And Malika, as somebody who likes to travel, I'm sure you've gone places to kind of see the big prize, but then in the process, seeing all the other stuff too is so much fun. But of course, kind of getting back to the urban and the rural divide, one of the big things is, we have investment coming in rural infrastructure, but at the same time, too, how do you preserve heritage while doing that? I don't know. Is this something that you see too in India?
Yes, because I actually teach in a college which is in a rural belt, far from the city of Kolkata. So it is called Kalna, Kalna, and there are very historic monuments and historic temples, a place of temples, a city full of temples, and that is very, very much older. And that is the reason the Archaeological Survey of India is taking the maintenance part. They have taken up the maintenance part, Archaeological Survey, that is by the national, it's a national body which preserves this heritage. And there is a temple of, I think it's about our religious part called Sri Krishna, Lord Krishna's temple. It is a very, very old temple, and it was built in 1739. During the time, it's way back, and I still visit there and go, and there are beautiful decorations on the walls of the temple. But nowadays, due to of old age, much more and more preservation, more and more maintenance is needed, but it is becoming very expensive to maintain properly. It is very expensive to maintain. But still it is going on, and it's a heritage, it's of eastern part of India. Eastern Burdwan it is called. East Burdwan. It's actually far from the city. It takes about 2.5 hours from Kolkata to reach there. And people are trying, there are various trustees and boards who are trying their level best to preserve or maintain as much as possible to prevent the decay of those. Very precious things.
Do you find too, because this is something we run into with preservation here in the United States, is that some people assume you can preserve everything, and there's just certain things, for example, sometimes wooden floors that you're going to have to replace, and then inevitably you have somebody who comes in and says, well, the floor is not it's not historic, it is like, and we sometimes have to say, well, we understand that, and but at the same time too, certain things in buildings that do give out, that if you can't necessarily always preserve 100% of any structure. But But we do have, and I don't know in India if you all do this, but we have a lot of grants and things for historic preservation where,
Yes.
there's programs where people who work in construction can learn specifics about when it comes to preservation that may be beyond what would be in like a normal construction type
Mhm.
training. And of course, the big thing too is funding and resources.
Yeah.
Try to convince people that it's worth the investment.
Mhm.
And, because when you look at those like large scale heritage
Mm.
conservation or humanities projects, it is difficult sometimes to find the investment that it needs. And I'm
Right.
sure that that's something people all over the world who
Mm.
might hear this
Yes.
recognize. Because sometimes when we're so beholden to, well, will it make money if we preserve it?
Mm.
On the humanities side, many of us will say, well, in the end, it's not all about just the money.
Right.
It's preserving these things for the sense of cultural, not only identity, but also sharing it
Yes.
with those who come in and want to get a sense of our ancestors. So, I've had the opportunity to work and serve on our Arkansas Humanities Council here, and there are grants and things that are available, but there's also a lot of competition for those resources when they're limited.
Mhm.
And sometimes one thing I would always, no matter where you are, if you do have any grants available, something I encourage people to do is actually reach out and call the people and ask them for help if you need
Yes,
it.
yes. I was just recollecting. I visited in Hampton Court Palace in London. That was the palace of the King Henry VIII. Uh,
Yes.
yes, and it was so well maintained. They have kept the moment live. And local actually students have raised funds.
Wow.
Yes, they have raised funds for heritage, for preservation of of that royal palace. And one person dressed as King Henry VIII, and the queen around him was roaming around the palace, and the kitchen was alive with the butcher cutting meat. Oh, it was wonderful experience for me. They kept the lively, the moment live. It was
Yeah.
a great experience at the Hampton Court Palace. So people should come up, no? Even these students and the common people have raised funds for that preservation, and they are maintaining it till today. I know that. It's
And
great.
that's to see
Yeah.
that kind of care too coming from people, and
Yes.
also to a certain extent even marketing that history to try to then
Yes.
preserve and save and for others in the future. It's that's the thing I love about heritage is that there's so much overlap and so much we are really the people who are trying to connect the past not only to our contemporary period but
Right.
also to ensure that it's there for
Mm.
people in the future. And of course, I don't know, this may be something too, and I love that you use the example of the young people and the students trying to help because, one of the big challenges to a lot of rural areas is that there has been youth migration to urban areas. A lot of
Yes.
youth will not stay. And of course, in my studies, it was always interesting to find people who don't take an interest in their own heritage.
Right.
And sometimes even finding outsiders who take more of an interest in learning about traditions and things. And,
Yes. Yes.
and here's the thing, I'm a parent, I have a son. I
Uh-huh.
understand that I can't get him to like everything that I like.
Right.
And so I get it on even a micro level of, this is so important and you should love it.
Mm.
And, saying, well, now I would rather go do this. But in the process, it's finding ways
Yes.
to try to bring that back in, but also share it with
Mm.
others,
Definitely.
And of course, this is another thing I wanted to bring up because sometimes there's opportunities to make the most of spaces.
Mm.
We have this thing happening in the United States. It's kind of interesting. If you were ever able to, while you were here, visit a rest stop, we, unlike some countries, we actually have a lot of bathrooms available for people to use.
Yeah.
And I say that because anytime I've gone to Europe, I'm always thinking, do I have money to go to the restroom? Where the United States, we have a lot of open areas and things like rest stops. We've even seen attempts like at the state level to put heritage and cultural things
Right.
in these places to tell the story of the area as people are traveling through.
Yes.
In other words, somebody's coming to basically use the restroom and maybe buy a drink out of a vending machine, but in the process, you can also give them a sense of place where you are. And so for example, there's a restaurant to the north of me that has a big thing on drainage and how the area was drained and deforested and then drained. Well, of course, I'm sure a lot of people who go into the restroom aren't expecting to have a cultural lesson like that. But at the same time, too, they do go away with it. And there's a lot of push to put things like in welcome centers and even in colleges where you have a space.
Yes.
Because museums are so expensive. Museums are very expensive. There's the museums here in the United States, like the Smithsonian that draw in so many visitors, they're able to maintain it because it's paid for in large part by taxpayer money. So they are amazing. But I've had so many instances where people will say, well, this museum should be doing this, this, and this. And you have to come back and say, well, that would be great if you have somebody who's willing to donate $2 or $3 million. Because the thing that telling that story is much more expensive than what many people realize. And so that's a big challenge.
Generous grants are needed. Generous grants are needed very much.
I will give you an example too that's actually over in Tennessee, but there's a family that created a chain of stores in the United States, and it's the Kirkland family, and they did this very generous thing where they decided to build a discovery museum that has history, science, it has all kinds of phenomenal things. They chose to build it outside a very small town that was kind of engaging in rural decline. And they did that rather than build it near a big urban center. And they did it for the purpose, from what I've understood, to try to help the economy grow.
Right.
And so sometimes it's finding those people who are looking for some sort of philanthropic cause but they recognize doing it in certain places can have an impact that might not otherwise. And so looking for those opportunities is a big thing. And also community-led initiatives, trying to empower people to recognize how important their cultural heritage is and just passing down traditions.
Exactly.
Teaching, I've been teaching history for over 20 years. And sometimes if I'm teaching something and saying, well, there was, deforestation was a big thing in Virginia, when the early English colonists arrived here. I will have students sometimes who kind of fade out on me. But if I start talking sometimes about deforestation in this area, suddenly there's a sense of, oh, well, now that makes more sense to me.
Right.
Because I know what you're talking about. I've seen some of these areas that actually still have some of those older trees and things that weren't cut down.
Yeah.
And so many people can be encouraged to recognize the value of their history.
Yeah.
And then hopefully doing that, we can encourage people to then also want to learn about the heritage of others.
Right.
If it's important to you and that tradition is important to you, then perhaps maybe the traditions somewhere else are important to those people. And so if you get a chance to go to London, you see somebody dressed like Henry VIII.
Yeah.
Actually say, oh, well, there's something about these, British people even today. They're fascinated still with the royal line and everything that it's brought. And I think, too, the digital technology, we've already talked about this, Malika, because here we are.
Yes. This digital technology, this is a very emerging area in India, too. Scholars are coming up with doing PhD on digital archivist and using various digital tools for archive as data collection. So these sort of things are coming up now in India, very emerging sector, which is coming up these days. And I have found various scholars in my platform too, who are engaged in these areas of digital learning, which is very much focused in our research in India now.
And if we think about it, once upon a time there would be some international conference
Yeah.
that we'd all try to see if our institutions could fund or apply for a supplemental grant, and then
Yes.
all fly in and maybe get to meet and network with each other. But the fact that the expense and the time,
Yes.
things, as I mentioned when we first started, that you're doing is so phenomenal
Yeah.
because we can come together. It's with hardly any, if any, cost.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but most academics I know would love to talk about what they do. They want to
Yes.
talk about the research. And many
Yes.
of us, we do it for
We
free.
are feeling
It's what we do.
excited. Yeah.
We're passionate about it.
Because I found that in the new year from January onwards, various states in USA are hosting international conferences on archive as data collection. I have found it in Columbia University, in various states of US. I found there are various international conferences being held on this
Yeah.
archive as data collection and other
Well,
things on digital platforms.
and I think too that, when it comes to fostering partnerships, I've seen more connections in just the last few years, probably since just the pandemic, of institutions trying to come together,
Yes.
especially, in some countries that university system is considered to be so high up here, and then you'll have lower, museums are down here. But I've seen more of a sense of, we really do need to connect, and we need to connect as scholars.
Yeah.
But we also need to connect as people who care about culture and recognize that we need to tell people why what we do is important,
Yeah.
that we do it for all people.
Yes.
It is not necessarily for getting an article published that your peers will,
Yes.
commend you or critique you for.
Yeah.
That if we're not doing stuff that is driven towards, just people who have careers outside of what we do, but also saying, this is still important and we care about you. Because I think that's what most scholars do. Most scholars do, we do research because we care about people.
Yeah.
In humanities. I mean, that's why we are humanities. But it kind of leads, my last point here is just saying that anybody can be an advocate, and you don't necessarily have to have a degree in history to care.
It's a very good point you have raised, that it is not necessary to become a historian or in the discipline of history to learn heritage and preservation. It's a very valid point and very interesting point that you have raised.
Yeah, and I can one last point here. I have a few images here that are from the Hampson Museum that's in this area that has indigenous artifacts. It is a person over 100 years ago who basically had land, and he started finding indigenous artifacts on it. And he and his wife become basically amateur archaeologists and go to great lengths in their spare time to try to bring things out of the ground. And donated them. We have seen a lot of evolution in the laws of indigenous artifacts in the United States for very good reason. But of course, what they did was long before a lot of those efforts were made. But these are people who had no training, but recognized the importance of it. And then once they took artifacts from the ground, they decided they shouldn't really own them. That those should then be put and worked with the local tribes to find a way to display them that was respectful. And so when looking at advocating, while we should be cognizant of laws and things, but again, that kind of goes back to, if you want to be an advocate and you don't know, call somebody or email somebody and ask them. That's one of the things that I've seen a lot of barriers with people who just they think they want to apply for a grant, but they don't know how to do it. And then so they just don't do it, versus just picking up and calling and saying, hey, I was thinking about doing this. How would I get started? I've been affiliated with organizations that literally employ people, mostly just to help walk people through that process.
Right.
And, it does not hurt to ask. And it's incumbent, though, upon those of us who do fall more on the expertise side to remember that a lot of people don't know. And how can we help? And what can we do to make people feel more comfortable as they move into wanting to advocate for things outside. But that's just my opinion, Malika. That's what.
Yeah. It's
I
really wonderful to have you in our podcast today. It's really, really great, and thank you so much for
well, it's
giving
been my
your
pleasure.
precious time. Yes.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, and it's been a lot of fun, and I definitely want to stay in touch.
Yes, hopefully we can collaborate with each other and do some project in future.
That
Yes.
would be great. That would be
Yeah.
great.
Yes, yes. Yes. And keep well, stay safe and healthy, and do more and more research in your area. All the best. And
All the best. The
yeah.
best and the same to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Yes,
so
yes.
much, Gillian. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, bye. Bye-bye.